My name is Pat Lacey, and I'm the author of the book Historic Hayward and Sawyer County Sketches. It is a non-fiction rendition of historic occurrences that took place in Hayward and in Sawyer County. Footnotes document each resource I utilized. I personally feel all historic texts should be written this way, noting sources. I'm very adamant about that. I'm delighted when I find a book that has been written that way, because if I'm using it for research, then I can go back, find the footnotes, and get to the original source. My book also contains over 40 historic photos. If you've read my book jacket, you know that history's always been a passion of mine. For 20 years, I was a National Register consultant. I worked with the Historical Society, the National Park Service, and property owners, preparing over 40 successful National Register nominations for historic buildings and structures in Wisconsin. Are you familiar with the National Register of Historic Places? A little bit. For those of you who may not be familiar, it is a register or roster which is juried by the National Park Service, whereby buildings such as houses, barns, commercial buildings, boathouses, and structures such as water towers, silos, fountains, locomotives, and sites such as battlefields, gardens, burial mounds, and shipwrecks are nominated for placement. These nominations go through a rigorous examination, having to meet very stringent criteria. If successful, they're listed in the National Register and become eligible for both state and federal tax credits for approved restoration and renovation. Eau Claire County has 64 properties listed in the National Register. So that's, good job goes out to all. Now, I believe history can be fun. I've always tried to make sure my clients had fun with the National Register process. Many folks had no idea of the true significance of their properties. Next slide. One such property owner is Kevin Gropp from Neillsville, Wisconsin. He owns the 1964 New York World's Fair Wisconsin State Pavilion, pictured here, which houses his 3 radio stations, WCCN AM and FM and WPKG FM. Not at all impressed by history, Kevin agreed to proceed with the National Register nomination for the pavilion when the Neillsville Historic Preservation Commission offered to fund the project. Wisconsin almost did not have an exhibit at the 1964 World's Fair. Wisconsin state law prohibited the use of tax dollars, and the proposed project looked to have a price tag of over $1 million. Hearing that Wisconsin would not have an entry, Clark Pruden, president of Pruden Steel in Evansville, Wisconsin, stepped forward. He hired architect John Steinman and commissioned him to design a low-cost structure utilizing Pruden Steel's prefabricated products. After the fair, the pavilion was dismantled and moved to Boscobel, where it sat in storage. Howie Sturtz, the owner of WCCN at the time, purchased the building and moved the pieces to Neillsville. He then had it reassembled on Highway 10 east of Neillsville as the home of his radio station. Okay, let's get to the point of my story. Kevin was easy to work with, providing me with any historic materials that he knew of. I lamented that we didn't have the blueprints for the building. Kevin said he'd never seen any blueprints since his ownership, which had now been almost 25 years. One day in the middle of the afternoon, about 3 weeks after I started the project, I got a phone call, and it's Kevin. He was all excited. They'd been cleaning a lower level storage area, and lo and behold, they found the blueprints. Could I come right away? I said sure, and upon arrival, the 2 of us pored over the blueprints on a large table. They were wonderful. It was then that I said to Kevin, "Isn't history fun?" And he replied, "Not until you came along." And that's the primary goal with this book, to make history fun, or at least interesting enough so that I can reveal to you the depth of history within my sketches. Okay, to the book. Next slide. My book begins with the mastodon and ends with the mighty muskie. Next. My first three sketches touch on the Ojibwa Indians, the logging era, and the creation of the Chippewa flowage. Next slide. Currently, your museum has an exhibit titled On the Water, highlighting mid-20th century summer fun, resorts, fishing, and making memories. My book delves into much of that history. So let's start with the resort era. Even though the land in Sawyer County lay bare of trees after years of logging, the many crystal clear lakes, rivers, and the newly formed Chippewa flowage would bring forth an industry which would last for decades, the resort era. Anglers soon discovered that these many waters offered world-class fishing, and many of these lakes and rivers also held the mighty muskellunge. Rumors of giant muskies lurking below helped to fuel this new enterprise. Resorts started to be built on the many shores of the many Sawyer County lake shorelines, and resorts began to attract big city fishermen and vacationers. As the popularity of the affordable automobile grew and the 40-hour work week was cemented into daily life, a vacation became a reality for an ordinary American worker. Farmers who were failing at agriculture were the first to discover that there was money to be made building and renting cottages on the shores of Sawyer County lakes. Many were struggling to eke out a living due to the poor soil quality and the short northern growing season. Okay. Nope, you skipped one. There. Oh, sorry. Let's explore dairy farmer Olaf Treland, who founded an empire. Currently, Treland's resort entails 4 resorts on the Chippewa flowage and a campground just off the flowage. The Treland empire began when Olaf Treland made the best decision of his life. In the early 1920s, he was approached by the Minnesota Light and Power Company to sell his property, which would be partially flooded by the new Chippewa flowage. Olaf refused to sell. He was quoted as saying, "I don't think the cows will mind being closer to the water." At first, Olaf did not see the potential before him. He sold 6 acres of his shorefront land to Bob Kamak. Kamak built several cottages, which he rented to vacationers and fishermen. Kamak's resort success did not go unnoticed by Olaf. Soon, Olaf built 6 cabins on his remaining shorefront, offering unpretentious accommodations. From this simple beginning, the Treland Empire began. I don't know if any of you have been to the Chippewa flowage or have been to any of Treland's resorts, but the one that's off of County Highway B has the best pizza anywhere. Okay, next slide. This is Moody's camp. Ted Moody was a crackerjack auto mechanic for many of the famous race car drivers in early 1920s Chicago. Eddie Rickenbacker, Barney Oldfield, and Henry Ford's racing teams all used his expertise. He became seriously ill from auto exhaust fumes, and his physician sent him north to breathe the fresh pine air. With help of Ojibwa Hank Smith, Ted and Hank built a stunning group of log buildings known as Moody's Camp. In 1923, a large log lodge and 13 log cabins were built on the west shore of Spider Lake. Next. This was a fancy resort. Everyone was expected to dress for dinner. This sketch is a fun read about meals such as prime rib, T-bone steak, lobster, Swedish smorgasbord, fancy picnics, and camp activities that included tennis, fishing, hiking in the woods, square dancing, and costume parties. Each day, pine boughs were hung from the beams to give off that piney, woodsy smell for guests. You can see them hanging on at least two of the pictures here. Okay, next slide. When a large muskie was caught, it was brought up to Myrtle's flower bed. A bell was rung and it was hung on a large scale. Then the cook prepared the fish whole. It was placed on a large platter and a waitress would parade the fish around the dining room to the oohs and ahs of the diners. Now, I prepared the National Register nomination for the lodge, and the lodge is currently operated as a very nice bed and breakfast. Okay, next slide. Yeah, gangsters. Even Chicago gangsters need a vacation. This section of sketches called Gangsters, Wardens, and Muskies has proven to be the favorite, at least with my family and friends. In this collection, I detail the history of three gangsters: Joe Solstice, who had a property on Barker Lake; Al Capone, who had a property located south and west of the Chippewa flowage and south of County Road C; and Joe Ayupa. These stories are intertwined with illegal muskie fishing, threatening wardens at gunpoint, planning hideous crimes, and boastful claims of a fishing title. Okay, next. My research indicates that the Capone compound was owned by Al Capone, although never in his name. Capone never signed a check nor a deed for any property. All the property that he owned in Wisconsin or Illinois, speakeasies, dog tracks, and various business fronts, were always in one of his lawyers' names. He only conducted business in cash. The reason the feds could never find his Wisconsin resort was the purchase of the property from Clarence Weiss, Coudray Land Company, was never registered until Capone went to jail and his bookkeepers wanted to sell the property. Next. Now, the lower right slide is a reenactment. They didn't have actual photos at but the top right is from that day. Through FBI documentation, which consisted of depositions by criminals who participated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and who were seeking to cut a deal for less jail time, I established that the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was planned at the Capone compound. You will read about the life of Capone, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, both the planning and execution, and Edward O'Hare, a trusted Capone associate who gave Capone to the feds. He met a very unpleasant end. While he was driving his new Lincoln in Chicago, a passing car shot him in the face with a shotgun. O'Hare's son wanted to attend the Naval Academy, and O'Hare knew he would need a U.S. congressman to recommend him. Worried that his life of crime with Capone would jeopardize his son's dream, Edward O'Hare worked with Eliot Ness and Frank Wilson to give up Capone. Several years prior, at a raid of a Capone speakeasy, 3 ledgers were taken into evidence. However, they were in code. O'Hare gave the feds the bookkeeper who translated the revenue reflected in the ledgers, leading to the charges of income tax evasion, which sent Capone to prison. O'Hare's son did attend the Naval Academy, and he went on to become a famous World War II ace pilot who was killed in action. O'Hare Field in Chicago was named in his honor. Okay, next one. Joe Solstice was a few years older than Capone. Although they were never partners, they did operate peacefully in some of the same Chicago areas. Solstice fancied himself as the beer baron, transporting his illegally brewed beer from Wisconsin to the speakeasies of Chicago. When Solstice almost went to prison for murder in 1930, he decided to retire from crime and moved to a large tract of land on Barker Lake in Sawyer County. Here, he built a resort where Chicago criminals could enjoy a break from crime. Okay. Oh, wait, can you go back? Go back one. If you look at the center picture here with Solstice bending over, writing a check or signing something, the little creepy guy behind him his name is Machine Gun Frankie McErlin, who was obviously a bodyguard henchman. I have a little story later on where he plays a large role. Okay. The resort consisted of 6 log cabins, a 23-room lodge, a 9-hole golf course, a house for Solstice, and a 38-acre deer enclosure. In the 30s, venison was very popular. All of this remains today. At his resort, Solstice was far from the prosecutors of Chicago, but could still manage his crime enterprises. Solstice and his men were famous for ignoring Wisconsin's fish and game laws. They really liked to fish for big muskies and big walleyes in the restricted refuge area below the Winter Dam. Now, Winter Dam is what backs up the Chippewa flowage. Yes, back that up, right. Okay. This is Game Warden Ernie Swift. He was the Dudley Do-Right for Sawyer County. Swift was merciless in preventing Solstice and his men from breaking Wisconsin fish and game laws, especially when illegally fishing below the Winter Dam. Swift was a small-framed man, only 5 feet 8 inches tall with red hair, but he was a tough cookie. There are several sketches in my book which describes encounters between Solstice and game wardens led by Warden Swift. They originate from a magazine article Swift wrote for True, a man's magazine. The article was called An Officer's Duty. Here, Swift recounts his many encounters with the Solstice gang as they violated Wisconsin fish and game regulations. This same article was also used for an episode of General Electric True, a TV show which had 33 episodes that ran from 1962 to 1963. It was hosted by Jack Webb and William Conrad. His exploits as a young game warden are fun to read. I thought I'd give you a short example of the wonderful expressive dialogue that he used in his writings. What I'm going to read today is an encounter with some of the muscle from Solstice gang by another warden under Swift's supervision. This warden was known as Warden Percy Button. You gotta love the name. In July of 1928, Warden Percy Button observed 4 men fishing the turbulent water below the winter dam. One of the men hooked into a large fish, and when his reel froze up, they started to pull his line in hand over hand until a large muskie was pulled up onto the bank. It was at this point that Warden Button stepped out from the cover of the brush. Well, fellas, looks like you've got a dandy, but it also looks like I've got you. I'm a game warden, and you're all under arrest for fishing in a refuge. Button put his hand in the muskie's gills and hoisted it up, confiscating the fish. At this point, the largest man of the group pointed a Colt 45 at his midsection, saying, "Drop that fish, punk, or I'll dump ya." As Button dropped the fish to the ground, fear gripped him as he realized he was facing Machine Gun Frankie McErlin. McErlin began kicking the muskie toward the bank, where it finally dropped off into the water, recovered, and swam away. "There now, what you gonna do? You got no evidence." Fearlessly, Button replied, "I don't need the fish. You'll be in court at Hayward on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock. I'm sure the judge will take my word for what happened here today." Turning, Warden Button made his exit, expecting a bullet would take him down. The bullet did not come, but then neither did the 4 poaching violators show up in Hayward. And there's other really neat stories. No matter how many times that Swift or Button arrested them, they went out and just reviolated. Okay, this is gangster Joe Alupa. No, that's Ayupa.
It says on the picture, gangster Joe Solstice.
Oh, that's my bad. That is incorrect. That's Joe Solstice. Thank you for pointing that out. I will have to change that. Joe Ayupa rose in the ranks of Al Capone's enterprises as his enforcer. Capone groomed Ayupa to step in his shoes after he left for prison. Ayupa ran the Capone enterprise, expanding the gang's presence to the Las Vegas casinos. He was indicted for skimming money from the casino profits before paying taxes to the IRS. Ayupa was sentenced to 28 years in prison. He only served 10 of those years, being released for health reasons. He died a year later at the age of 79. Ayupa loved to musky fish, and his favorite fishing hole was, wait for it, below the winter dam. Prior to 1986, Ayupa, now in his late 60s, was fishing crappies on a northern Illinois lake. Another boat was also on the lake that day. That boat held Spence Petros, a famous musky fisherman. Both boats exited the lake at the same time. At the boat ramp, Petros and Ayupa realized immediately who each other were. They were making small talk about the weather, the catch of the day, and musky fishing when there was a pause in the conversation. Ayupa looked at Petros and said, "You know, I caught the world record muskie." Petros just smiled, thinking this was going to lead into a joke, when Ayupa went on to say, "No, I mean it. I caught the world record muskie. I sold it to Louis Spray for $50. He went on to say he caught it below the winter dam fishing at night. This sketch explores whether Ayupa's claims could be true, as well as delving into Louis Spray's rendition of the events of the day. Unfortunately, when Louis arrived at Herman's Landing with the fish, he lied about where he caught it, like all good fishermen do. He said he caught it on Fleming's Bar. Only problem was, guide Tony Burmick spent the whole day on Fleming's Bar with a client, and he never saw Louis, nor did he hear any gunshot, because they shot them when they were that big. It was still legal to shoot them at the side of the boat. Tony was well respected, and that created all sorts of problems for Louis Spray. How many affidavits did Louis have to provide the authorities? If you believe Joe Ayupa, you must learn how long you could hold a fish out of water and still have it appear fresh. How would they have executed the transfer of the fish? You will have to read this sketch to see what direction the puzzle pieces point to. Okay, can't believe I put that on. Here we see the two most famous muskies ever caught in Sawyer County. These two fish have brought more tourists to Sawyer County than any brochure, advertisement, or sports show. On the left, sports writer Cal Johnson, world record caught in July of 1949 out of Lake Lecoudere, weighed 67 pounds, 8 ounces, and was 60¼ inches long. On the right, Louis Spray's current world record, caught on October 20th, 1949, out of the Chippewa Flowage, weighed 69 pounds, 11 ounces, and was 63¼ inches long. That's how tall I am. That's a big fish. These two fish really kicked off the sport of muskie fishing. The mounts of these fish were displayed at sport shows across the country. Coupled with that of the Burmick's 12 Days of Muskie Fishing coming up next, which was covered in newspapers and magazines, brought fishermen to Sawyer County by the thousands. It's kind of interesting in that you think of Louis Spray as being kind of a tough cookie, almost a gangster himself. And he had 3 world records. He also caught some very large walleyes. And he had those fish all mounted. When he was a bar operator, he displayed them in his bar. And in later years, he was in real estate in Rice Lake. And he was in the process of building a new office. And they were working on the heating. All the fish were just stored in there at that point. And he stopped in the morning to start, either it was like an oil burner or a coal operated stove, and left to get a cup of coffee when the building caught on fire. He lost all of his fish. And in his memoirs, it was quite touching how he explained that it was like his life was gone. He was kind of a neat guy. Okay, next slide. Another amazing feat is described in my sketch on the Burmick brothers. Here, I document a 12-day fishing marathon that they launched in 1955. Fishing Round Lake, the Chippewa Flowage, and Lake Lecoudere, they caught over 42 muskies. Tony and Fred Burmick totally mesmerized Hayward with their fishing prowess. The whole town would arrive at Rifkin's General Store for their daily weigh-ins. Freezers began to fill up in Hayward. After each daily weigh-in, the Burmicks gave their muskies away so they could fish the next day. The bag limits on muskies was 1 fish. You can read about the weather struggles that literally ground these men down, and the magic bait, which I'll pass around. That they fished with. Now, out of the 42 muskies, they only kept 17. And many of you may know now that most musky waters are record waters. The fish have to be 50 inches or greater. But at that time, when they caught all these muskies, they kept the big ones. The big ones you think of as being the females, the spawners. And they got so many of them out around Lake, which really right now is not fished for muskies very often. Most people are fishing the Chippewa flowage, grindstone, or Lac-Courte. So as a muskie fisherman who believes in catch and release, all of the muskies that we've caught, we've had what do they call those? Mounts. They're not the fish, replicas. You take them pictures and measurements and they make you a replica. Where here, they kept all those fish and people ate them. And so you do have to wonder what kind of an effect that had on a lake like Round Lake, that at this time was producing massive muskies, but with keeping them, did that have an effect on what they would produce in the future? Okay, I have a cute little excerpt here. We talked a little bit about treelands before, and the man that runs treelands now was a young boy when they did this adventure in 1955, Harold Treeland. And he was working as a dock boy at one of his father's resorts. And the magazine that did the article on the Burmicks also interviewed Harold. And Harold Treeland remembers Tony as a snazzy dresser while he was working as a dock boy at his father's resort. It was a production when they went out. Tony wore the big laced up boots and socks up to his knees. You know how sportsmen used to dress, and he'd have on that trademark fedora hat. They fished hard, even when it was cold. They fished any conditions, and they were out all day. It was old style. So you can kind of imagine them as being quite dapper going out to the boat. No. Okay, next. Find my place. So there aren't any more world records swimming around, right? On the left is a 68-inch muskie that was captured by a DNR spawning and egg collection crew in the 1950s. This muskie was 5 inches longer than Louis Spray's world record. The large jaws on the right, with the man's hands centered within, were found in 1998 on the banks of the Chippewa flowage. It was estimated by a fish biologist that this fish could have been up to 70 inches in length. Unless an experienced muskie angler with heavy equipment is the one who encounters this fish, the chances of a crappie angler with light tackle landing one that just grabbed his jig and minnow is slim and none. There is another world record out there, and there's no reason to think that it couldn't be hiding in Wisconsin waters. Okay, next slide. Maybe you have the world record swimming in your waters. The muskie on the left comes from one of your rivers, and the muskie on the right comes from Lake Wissota. My final sketch in the book is on the mighty muskellunge. It contains biological information on growth, breeding, habitat, and the proper handling of a muskie after they are caught. Okay, next slide. In closing, I must admit that in my book, I do unapologetically combine my love of muskie fishing with Sawyer County historical sketches. I've dedicated my book to my dad, who taught me how to trout fish when I was about 8 years old. I point out in my bio that fishing was so important to me that my husband had to pass a fishing test before I would marry him 54 years ago. Would you like to expound on that event?
Well, at that time it was trout fishing, but yeah, I wasn't quite sure if I was getting into something that I wasn't prepared for. We had got up at about 3 a.m. and drove over 100 miles to Waushara County, and
The Pine River.
yeah, made our way in the dark through the brush to this tiny little stream that was no more than 10 feet across. And then Pat showed me how to throw the worm into the water. I had done mostly boat fishing in my lifetime. And then to watch the line and how the line moved in the current and whether it stopped or moved upstream, which meant a fish grabbed the worm and took off. And she showed me how to set the hook, and she landed the fish, it slid it up onto shore, pounced on top of it, put her hands in the gills, and ripped its head open, blood spurting all over her face and her front. And she told me that was how you bled a fish out, so it was good eating. I wasn't quite sure if I was marrying a fisherman or a cannibal.
His eyes got real big. It worked out. Fishing has been a big part of my life, and it's what brought my husband and I to Hayward 19 years ago, first camping, and now we live there permanently. So is history fun? I hope so. I hope I've made it interesting enough to reveal something to you tonight that you did not know. Since completing my book, I continue to find more amazing historic information. Therefore, I'm working on volume 2.